It just, from that point, I knew that a part of whatever my journey was had to have been creating some type of safe spaces for people who absolutely needed it.
Yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man?
My name is Robert. I am a mental health coach. I do a lot of mental health specialist types of works, and building safe space communities is one of them. I have worked in the field of mental health for, I would say, almost 20 years, definitely over 12-ish, in the 15-ish kind of space. I just learned a lot, and I took what I learned to kind of develop my own style of practice and work on different types of approaches to mental health, more of a holistic approach. So I provide mental health coaching to people across the country, all over the US. And I facilitate safe spaces for underserved communities, specifically BI plus Black men. I started in an organization of representation for these types of identifying people. Yeah, I like long walks on the beach, close to the boardwalk, not in the sand.
Thank you for all your work in the space, and I too love the beach but hate the sand, so I can get behind the boardwalk walk. Um, and I have so many questions to ask about your work. But I'll start with just our core questions about, in general, like why you were interested in discussing masculinity with us, and where you think you either developed an interest or developed a certain perspective you have on it.
Masculinity has been something I've always been interested in exploring and learning more about. Um, I had a lot of experiences that took away from my own masculinity and made me kind of feel almost like an imposter to be in that type of environment or to be in that type of emotion. It was just interesting. I think it was just like a coincidence that you hit me up and said, "Hey, I want to have this conversation," because it's a conversation that I find myself having very often with a lot of people. I know that we live in a society where having that type of understanding, regardless of where it comes from or regardless of how you identify with it, can be really important, but also a society that tries to fill in the blank for you. And that creates a really big divide, especially in the mental health space, which is a lot of what I've had to go through to discover what masculinity was to me. So I think it probably was just fate that you just reached out with that talking point, because I'm always interested in having that conversation, especially because I know there are other people dealing with this type of a struggle. So I want to share that experience and help them as well.
Hmm. Yeah, no, there's so many times where uh, societal masculinity can be a strong impediment for healthy mental health. And so I'm curious, in your many years in working in the mental health space, trying to be an advocate for folks and help them through struggles. Where do you see masculinity playing a role there as an obstacle or an impediment, especially for men trying to make progress in their mental health?
Wow. Okay. I think the beginnings of that, well, the place that I see it the most prominent and in talking about adult men is in grief, in the grieving process, because masculinity has some type of social association with the ability to tap in and be consumed with your feelings. There's stigmas against crying or being emotional, or feeling vulnerable or feeling submissive or feeling weak. And all of these emotions are things that you will go through in grief cycles. So I find that when it comes to mental health, masculinity, I see it the most in that space. The concepts of masculinity often prohibit people from grieving properly, and families that center themselves around these microaggressions towards masculinity tend to have like a almost like a grief avoidance type of a pattern. And through that pattern, kind of reinforces that if emotions are present in a person that is meant to be masculine, then there must also be a divide. So you kind of have to hide your grief process almost, or
Mm-hmm.
sabotage it and turn it into something else that is more acceptable by your standards of masculinity. So I would say in the adult space, I think that's where the most that I've seen it personally. In terms of children and a developmental space, I think I see it in mental health in terms of when there is trauma taking place, there is like a staged authority. And then there is this, I guess, understage or understated person. So a part of the social idea of masculinity is this dominance and this dominating presence that you have. But when someone has experienced adverse childhood experiences that make them feel like they've been stripped of that, it can be really hard for them to find themselves back to a healthier form of that or allow themselves to exist in masculinity having had that type of a history, which can lead to other self-sabotaging behaviors like later on in life. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say those are the two main areas that I've seen masculinity and mental health, but I've never been asked that question before. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, and so well explained. I think on the adult side, that makes a lot of sense to me, just because grief is such a outwardly emotional process, and it really interesting sharing in the context of children. I spend no time thinking about that, but and it is important to remember, like with our platform, children are on Instagram and YouTube and looking at videos too, and so having some thought towards like the younger age demographic is really important. So thank you for sharing that. And on the adult side, that kind of um, impediment is what I was looking to hear you explain. So thank you for putting that out there. I think that the impediment is when there is a process that takes some emotional output, and that as a
Mm-hmm.
requirement for making progress, it can be really challenging for men to make progress, and they get stuck with the kind of need to have that guard up, and it just prevents a healthy progression. I'm curious, on the flip side, have you other influences for masculinity in terms of mental health that have positive effects you've seen, or trends that can actually help men get through a hard time or improve their mental health or fortitude? Is there a flip side where you've seen some positivity?
I think the mental health industry is starting to be a lot more fluid and meet people more so where they are. And I think that offering a variety of spaces and respecting each of these different types of spaces as therapeutic allows for men who identify with masculinity in different scales and in different identities to actually come forward and receive services. So, for example, there are doctors who provide psychotherapy, but there's also now mental health coaches like myself who provide therapy. And there's also online groups and spaces that provide validation and all of these different things. And they're just kind of bringing it to people versus waiting for people to come to them. So I think that that approach kind of allows men from a lot of different backgrounds when it comes to masculinity to find themselves in a level of help and care that feels like it's not threatening or emasculating to them. Going to the doctor, there's a lot of like stigmas of masculinity that prevent men from seeking medical attention when it comes to their mental health. So I like that there's different opportunities. I think that is something that's helpful. And I think also the general conversation. The fact that we are now at a time where we can have conversations like this online. And I think that as long as the conversation continues to progress and we normalize the human experience and normalize emotions, regardless of where they come from, and validate those things, I think we are starting to open doors for different types of masculinity to exist, as well as the lack thereof.
Hmm. Yeah. No, and you were talking about the growing conversation. I was just thinking about uh, our page, which was a very small Instagram page, and then COVID hit, and everyone's Googling men's mental
Yeah.
health, and up and to the right. And so, um, for sure, there's some heartening growth in the conversations. I think at the same time, there's a lot of content that is harmful and damaging. Where if you, same thing, if you search masculinity, that all the top 20, 50 accounts are just, in my
Yeah.
opinion, unhealthy sigma male, alpha male, grind set, hustle culture.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. And I,
that's
I
why
used to be, I was almost a victim to that. I found myself like right before the pandemic, I found myself kind of wanting to understand the space, like a little bit more about male grooming and things like that, especially during the pandemic, because I had to cut my own hair. So, and I found what you were talking about and looking for that. It was like, there's this machismo that is associated with self care at the sake of not making self care and grooming seem too feminine almost.
mm,
And that overcompensation was really uncomfortable for me. I just was like, whoa, this is a lot of energy and it
mm.
feels really uncomfortable. It feels very invalidating. And so I had to be more mindful of where and how I consumed content on the internet.
Yeah, and it is, a lot of it can be intoxicating, just because there's so many elements of power and prestige and like
Mm-hmm.
winning, and it's. But I think a lot of it focuses on you as a male being completely on your own, independent, with no help, kind of you against the world,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
not the way that anyone should go through the world, just because community
No.
and support is so important. On that community piece, you mentioned like creating spaces. Um, I was wondering what that looks like. Like, how do you develop? Is it a community, or how do you set the stage for someone to become more comfortable sharing? What is like your community development or safe space development look like?
Oh, so I think that for me, it started with you have to you have to have an objective. Like, what do you want to do with this community that you want to build and develop? I briefly worked in the sector of suicide counseling, and after doing that for a couple of years, I realized that I knew that I wanted to take a direction in developing community, specifically for men who existed on the intersection of racial oppression as well as sexual discrimination. And so I saw the value in bringing that together. I think that anyone that wants to facilitate a community they have to kind of see the nature and the essence of what they're trying to do. Because a lot of times people build communities and don't know how to stabilize those communities emotionally, which is really important, especially when you're dealing with a lot of vulnerable people. So I got into learning about how to facilitate spaces and things like that. And for me, what that looks like is kind of just, we have a website, we have an Instagram page, but even offline, I make sure that I provide a level of support to these guys who may be going through unique experiences that they feel no one else is experiencing. And for bi plus Black men, I think that one of the unique emphases on that problem is a concept of masculinity that exists with the pressure of kind of where that places you on the spectrum of bisexuality and bi identity, but also how your cultural impacts and how masculinity has been woven into your sense, or how you've learned a sense of survival through masculinity, how that also impacts. And just being erased and invalidated from both of those ways. And working as a suicide counselor, I understood firsthand seeing how when we erase people and invalidate their experiences, their will to live becomes up for question, and it doesn't seem as far fetched to want to end it all, you know. And it just from that point, I knew that like a part of whatever my journey was had to have been creating some type of safe spaces for people who absolutely needed it.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and it's amazing to where you saw an issue, and took some action to facilitate support, for that problem. I'm curious on like a personal level, how do you take care of yourself when dealing with very emotional, and challenging topics like the space you work in? How do you keep your brain healthy?
Um, that is an ever changing strategy. I think it really depends on what my level of stress is with that. There are certain levels of stress that I'm really comfortable with and I'm familiar with. So something like maybe listening to music or taking my dog out for a walk or something like that, that may be enough to kind of reset me. Sometimes just kind of taking time away from whatever the stressor is. But there are some levels of stress that are not as comfortable. And so I need more of that. Like journaling or definitely calling and talking to a friend. That's something that I definitely made sure to do, especially after the pandemic. I used to never talk about my feelings, but I will text someone and say, hey, I have feelings. Deal with these feelings right now. But I think the most important thing that I keep in mind is that I have to have balance. So I can't treat every stressful situation as equal because some stressful situations are heavier than others. So regardless of what it is for me, I have to identify how heavy this thing is and how it feels. And then I have to counterweight it with something that I know is going to kind of balance that for me.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I'm sure a lot of people watching can relate with, uh, a stressful job in whatever field it may be. And I think healthcare, of course, is always going to be, uh, a challenging space mentally, just because the stakes are higher. It's not whether a company makes a few more dollars. It's really about the
Mm-hmm.
health of someone, and so the game, the stakes are always stressful. And so people who work in that space, I mean, it's I think it's so important to hear firsthand from someone who works, in the mental health space, like how you take care of yourself. So, um, always try and ask like more like from someone professionally, how do they, take care of themselves personally? Because I think men in busy fields forget to do that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't help people if you're not feeling, well yourself, you know?
What I will say is that once I kind of allowed myself to let go of this cliche or unhealthy concept of masculinity, my ability to care for myself increased a lot. Yourself to experience certain levels of emotion or practice certain levels of activity due to your fear of it being too feminine, then you're going to miss out on the benefits of what those experiences can do for you emotionally. So for me, kind of letting go of that really helped a lot in terms of how I'm able to exist in my own body and feel
Mhm.
comfortable 100% with who I am.
Was there something that helped you identify, like, okay, this perspective I have on masculinity is unhealthy and I want to change it? Or was there like a
Yeah,
role model that was, helpful and you're like, I want to be more like that? Like, what was that process like?
think it was a little bit of all of those things, but in a really unconventional way. I, in general, realized at some point that I was extremely unhappy, but I had been performing happiness to make other people comfortable. And that was rooted in ideas that I'd held onto for a really long time as about like how I, as a man, am supposed to identify with my thoughts and my feelings, how my happiness is supposed to be measured. So I, after being extremely unhappy and being alone in that unhappiness, I realized that performing for people kind of doesn't really have much value if you're with yourself at the end of the day. So I had to start to build a relationship with myself and build a relationship with my own space and prioritize the things that make me happy, that makes me feel comfortable, and not worry so much about how they look to other people. So I think that was like the first step for me to really get into realizing that I had a train of thought that wasn't necessarily helpful. Um, and with that, I think being exposed to other people who are there, because there's this like veil that once you get past it, there's other people over there too. You just would never see those people because you spend time on the unhealthy side of things. But starting to see that there were men in my life that also had emotions. They just, and I can't say they wouldn't talk about it, but they wouldn't talk about them with me because I never talked about my emotions. And they probably was curious as to whether or not that was even a safe space. So being able to see the same people in my life, but just in a different light, that kind of was really inspiring for me. So I would say that once I started taking that direction, the people in my life started becoming some level of role models because I was like, wow, I didn't realize that you had feelings too. I didn't know.
Yeah,
So
and then
that was it.
the connections get so much stronger once you kind of both take up, like, remove that veil and kind of see each other
Yeah.
as people. I also think that it is such an important first step of the process with that self reflection you talked about, where you kind of look inside, see some challenges and an unhappiness, and can identify uh, parts of it that were just performative, right? And that was contributing to the unhappiness. And so self reflection, checking in with yourself on what authentically makes you happy, regardless of whether or not it fits some
Mhm.
masculinity framework, um, is such an important first step to share. And I know I only took half an hour from you, so I wanted to check in, and I like to just open it up in the last few minutes, just for your thoughts, whether there's anything you want to share with our platform, just open ended, and then also like how, if you have any ideas for how you would like to collaborate, whether there's resources you would want to share or pages you want to link or favorite book or music. So just kind of like an open ended, anything else to share with the platform, and then second, like, how, if you have any ideas for how you would like to collaborate.
Okay. All those are really good questions. Uh I
You
don't
don't
know
need
that
like a
my
speech prepared.
I don't know that my I don't know that I do I have a favorite book? I don't think I've discovered my favorite book yet. I'm still looking for my favorite book. I kind of tend to be a bit dodgy with my attention, and so it's sometimes hard for me to get through a book.
Damn.
But I will say that the best books are the books that you can kind of relate to. And those are the ones that you remember the most. For resources, if you are looking for mental health resources or anything like that, you can head over to my Instagram page at Robert St. Michael, RobertSaintMichael, and then go to robertstmichael.com as well. We're going to be doing a lot of changes and adding even more resources for people that may or may not be looking for a community, but just kind of looking for some type of validation. And I really like this platform that you've created. I really like this platform. At some point, I would love to hear more about your journey in creating this space because I think it's a much needed niche of conversation. So it's great timing, and thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. Actually gave me some things to think about because a lot of the things we talked about, I hadn't kind of shifted it in that perspective. But I always appreciate some really great, healthy conversation. And I love that there is a platform here for people to gravitate towards. And I am looking forward to seeing what it grows into because I think it has a lot of promise.
Keep tabs on us for sure. We'll be here.
Definitely will. All right. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks for having
Thank
me
you so
again.
much. Of course, it's nice to meet you, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. So, what do you think it means to be a good man?
I don't think there's a single definition.
Things that make up a good man are just the things that make up a good person. Someone who's honest, someone who's decent.
You're also willing to express yourself in a healthy way, and you're in touch with your emotions as well.